Why do so many church leaders fail the very people they're there to serve? From broken trust to power struggles to abuses of finances, all over the place, we see church leaders failing over and over and over again, which is causing people left and right to walk away from church altogether. What in the world is happening? What's going on? And what should we do about it? Well, this is the conversation today. As we've been looking at the church, we're going to look today at church leaders and see what Jesus has to say about it all. Thanks for watching. This is Whiskey in the Writings, a place for the skeptic, the seeker, those who are trying to work through what they believe and still believe, but maybe just not like they used to. A place where you can question and wrestle with your faith honestly. My name is Joe Oliver, and for 2 decades now, I've been a part of churches, working at churches. And today, I'm here trying to help people like you take a next step. I have a master's degree in biblical theology. And if you have questions, well, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. All right, everybody, we are talking about church leadership. And I know this is a really big topic and maybe a scary one for some because of what you've experienced at the hands of those who have led poorly in your life. And I know for me, this is a big topic because, well, I was a pastor for all of my adult life in some capacity and served in churches my entire adult life. And so this is something that hits home to me. And so everything I'm talking about is a little bit through my own experience and what I've seen people, what I've read, but also when I talk to people, what they've experienced and what I've experienced. I've been on the back end of leaders that have failed me. And so I want to talk a little bit about where this comes from and what Jesus is inviting us into when we have this conversation. I want to say at the top here, not all church leaders are this way. Okay. Not all church leaders are bad. I have many friends who are leading in churches today that I love dearly, that are close to me, that I believe are doing their best to do it the right way. And yet, I've also been around a lot of people who only want to protect their empire, only want to think the way they want to think, and only want to lead the way that they want to lead. And that causes them to reject and push away those who are different from them. So I've seen it on both ends. And both of it is led through conviction, right? So at the end of it, all these people think that they're doing it the right way. So we're going to look at whether or not what you believe and how you actually get that done. What is Jesus inviting church leaders into? How should they posture themselves entering into church leadership? And so we're gonna examine that. But before we get into that, we've got some writings to talk about in correlation to this conversation. I'm just saying we got some things to discuss. But first, we got to get into some whiskey. All right, on this episode of Whiskey in the Writings, we are drinking, we have got some Uncle Nearest. Now, we've done Uncle Nearest in the past, and if you're not familiar with Uncle Nearest, it is a wonderful backstory to this whiskey that I encourage you to go online, go to their website and check out the backstory. I'm not going to reiterate it here, but it's a really cool story about how this came to be. And it's just normal off the shelf whiskey you get is really good. It's mid to high shelf, and the reason why I pulled this one out today is because it was a couple things about it that I really enjoy. One, it's a rye, and so I really like the flavor profile of a rye whiskey. It's 100 proof, so you're getting up there in the proof. So it's more than your traditional Uncle Nearest, and so it's got a bit more of a bite. But one thing that really stands out to me about this whiskey is when I first opened it, the smell is amazing. The very caramel notes, a sweetness to the smell, and it's like been one of, I don't know, like when I oftentimes do this, right? So I'll open it up and smell that and smell that. And it just smells great. And the payoff is that when you get to sipping it, it sips great. It's just a smooth, easy drink, neat or maybe on the rocks, but it is just a great drink for this episode today. Something smooth, something refreshing, and hopefully the conversation's that way too. So that's what we're drinking today. Whatever you have in front of you, go ahead, pour a drink, and take a sip. Here you go. Cheers and drink responsibly. Let's dive in. All right, for this portion of the writings, we're going to look at a specific story out of the one of the biographies of Jesus's life called Matthew. In the New Testament, the back quarter of your Bibles, it's the first book that you're going to come to in the series of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you have Matthew. And the reason why we're going to look at this story in particular is because when we talk about church leadership, and we examine, before I get into the I'm just saying, and we dive deeper into certain components of this conversation, for us to understand what should be for church leaders, we need to look at the life of Jesus and what he taught us. And the role of a church leader in whatever capacity in the church, whether that's a lead senior pastor or some associate pastor or a minister who works with children or youth or whatever, you're leading in a church in any capacity. There is a primary ethic of Jesus that must be followed. And if you do not observe this in your leaders, they're not leading in the way of Jesus. And this all has to do with a posture of leading. And it comes out of the 20th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. And it's a story about two of Jesus's followers who were interested in leading in God's kingdom and how Jesus responded to those two. And then in addition to that, there's a little teaching that Jesus gives to the rest of his followers to help them understand what it means for them to lead in comparison to what they see around them. So let's go ahead and just dive into the story. And then we're going to pull out some pieces that are relevant to what we're talking about today. So what you get in Matthew chapter 20, verse 20 is this. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee, James and John, came to him with her sons, and kneeling down, she asked him for a favor. So let's set the scenario. So you have these disciples, James and John, and their mother is around, whether they're hanging out somewhere or they're on the road somewhere, she's in proximity, as the story goes. And the mom has a desire for her children to have positions in God's kingdom, because this is the question that's brought to her. Verse 21 says, he said to her, "What do you want?" She replied, "Permit these two sons of mine to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your kingdom." So what is Jesus, or what is she inferring here? So she is assuming that at some point Jesus's kingdom, which for them wasn't a outer body, heavenly, disbodied, removed and gone up to heaven reality. They literally believed that Jesus was bodily and physically restoring God's rule and reign back on earth through God's people. This was the hope that Israel had, the people of Israel had at this time. And so through that lens, she is thinking that what Jesus is doing in his work when he burst onto the scene is to begin the ruling and reigning that they were hoping for. And so it was completely acceptable for this mom who has two sons who are extremely close to this future king, this future ruler, to want those kids to do well, to rule. And this putting my sons on your left and your right is a sign of authority. A king would have these helpers, these people that he would designate and help rule over, regions and kingdoms and make decisions. And so this idea of this left and the right is all about authority, positions of authority in God's kingdom. And what mom doesn't want their kids to succeed? And so she comes out of the scene. She sees what Jesus is doing. She has a hope in her mind of this great kingdom that's coming, that she wants her kids to be a part of. So kudos, mom. Every mom would do this. So Jesus replies, verse 22. Jesus answered, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup I'm about to drink?" They said to him, "We are able." So now the kids are involved because they said to him, the kids. So the mom makes the request, but then the kids are there too, kind of like maybe sheepishly standing on the side, like, "Mom, go ask, whatever the scenario. Um, but Jesus' response is interesting. He says, "You don't even know what you're asking." So Jesus is implying here that there's something about his rule and reign, his kingdom, that they haven't gotten yet, that they don't understand. They're missing something. And I love this because it is true. In those who followed Jesus, oftentimes they didn't understand everything that he said and did when he was on this earth. In fact, you very much get that in like John's gospel. He'll often say, "We didn't understand what he said." So here's an instance where clearly they don't get what Jesus is up to, because he's like, "I don't think you understand what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink?" So this idea of drink this cup is to participate in something that's about to happen to him. And so they, again, in their ignorance, well, yeah, of course we can do that, because they don't, right? It hasn't clicked yet. Jesus knows something that they don't know. So he's like, "Yeah, we can do that." He told them, "You will drink my cup, but to sit at my right and my left is not mine to give. Rather, it is for those whom it has been prepared by my Father." So here is simply like, okay, there's a lot that Jesus is saying here. What I want to draw out for this conversation is you have these two characters and their mother that have a picture of what it means to rule on behalf of God in his kingdom. And Jesus seems to imply here that they don't understand what it actually means to lead and rule in God's kingdom. How do we know that? Well, because this next section, he turns to the rest of his disciples, or the rest of the crowd, whoever's around him, and begins to expand on this idea a little bit further. So what is Jesus talking about? Why is this going to be different? And what does this difference look like for these followers of Jesus? Well, verse 24. Now, when the other 10 heard this, they were angry with the two brothers. All right, so now we have some jealousy going on, right? They're frustrated that the two brothers had the gall, they can't believe, like, "Oh my gosh, these guys." So they're angry with them. And then Jesus called to them. It says, verse 25, Jesus called them and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions use their authority over them." So so the Gentiles is just a term to mean anyone who is not Jewish. So when Jesus says the Gentiles, he's talking about anyone who's not Jewish. Okay. So the ruler of the Gentiles, those who are not Jewish, would have been the Roman Empire, Rome. It would have been Augustus. So you have this power structure that Jesus is saying, look, you've seen how other rulers and leaders rule, and they do it by oppression. This is what he means. They lord it over them. They exercise their authority by pressing upon down upon people. That's how they got their rule, right? So he's saying, you look around you And they use their authority to press down, okay, in an oppressive fashion. And he goes, so you've seen that, verse 26. But listen to this. This is key. It must not be this way with you. Jesus bursts on the scene and he says, you've seen how authority works around you. He says, but that's not how we're doing it. It must not be this way with you. And then he goes into his famous teaching. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So what we see here in this teaching is Jesus is upending a way of thinking of how authority works. It's as if in the minds of his followers, they have seen how the Roman Empire has led and conquered, and for some reason they think this is how it's done. This is how you do it. And Jesus says they oppress down. He says, not with us. This is how we lead. This is how we exercise authority, by leading up. We lower ourselves so we can build people up. It's a complete reversal of the way they see the world working currently. I can't imagine for someone who thought that they were following a leader who was going to take power and just, we're going to get rid of the Romans, we're going to take back our land, we're going to be a people finally with our own ruler and king in Jesus. And Jesus goes, heads up, we're not going to do it like that. There's a theory that maybe this is the kind of thing that led Judas to betray Jesus, one of his close followers. What would lead someone like Judas to betray him? And the hypothesis here is some have theorized that because Judas so desired God for Jesus, Judas wanted Jesus to take command, and he was playing the slow game, right? He wasn't doing it the way that they wanted him to do it. By Judas betraying Jesus and getting him arrested, it was a way that Judas thought maybe if Jesus is prompted, he'll then take over. And so it was a way to push Jesus's hand. Little did Judas know that Jesus's ultimate reality was that he was going to his death. When he makes statements like, can you drink the cup that I'm about to drink? Like, are you able to go through what I'm about to go through? Jesus had a different game in his head, a different agenda that just rocked. That, like, when we think of the impact, if Jesus was simply another, zealot that is trying to take back the land and become a leader for Israel, those people come and go and they die. And yet, when Jesus comes on the scene, he says, we're going to do it. We're going to do it different. His whole ethic, his whole practice, the way he built people, led from underneath and led up instead of top down. Those ethics have stayed with us for centuries. And so what Jesus is up to here in this teaching, the reason why I bring it up is to identify that any person in church leadership, first and foremost, has to lead as Jesus taught us to lead. And unfortunately and sadly, far too often, we see the reversal of this in many churches. And we're going to explore that a little bit more in the I'm Just Saying. Okay, so this is I'm Just Saying. And this portion might be a little bit longer because there's a few angles that I want to come at this conversation with. So if you're just chiming into this channel for the first time, just a little bit about me so you can understand my perspective, where I'm coming from. So as I've said in the opener, I've been working in churches for the past 2 decades in some capacity. I've done it both full-time, where I've been on a staff at a church full-time, and I've done it where I've also have done it bivocationally, which is to say I had another full-time job while I was leading in a church. And so I've done both. For starting June of 2000 is when I entered into full-time ministry. So I've been in churches. I've worked on teams in churches. I've been around pastors my entire adult life, being a pastor my entire adult life. And in fact, since January of 2025 is the first time that as I retired, I stepped away. I knew that this was not a path, being in pastoral leadership, that I was called to anymore, that I felt that I was called to anymore. I wanted to do. I wanted to do something different. Thus, we have Whiskey in the Writings and other things like Barstool Theology that my wife and I run, ministries that are more in tune with what we're up to and what we want to do. All that to say, I'm coming at this angle from two sides. One, I'm certainly going to address, kind of maybe what caused you to click on this video, the abuse that we see in church leadership and what I think can be done about that. But two, I'm also empathetic towards church leaders. And so let's just start here for a second. If you've been hurt by a church leader, a pastor, a minister, someone has hurt you, whether physically, emotionally, there's something there that has been abusive towards you. I don't want to downplay that. And I hope that you are safe, and I hope that you've moved on to a safe place, and that's not excusable. So I first want to full stop recognize that. If you are in an abusive situation, you need to get out. We would advocate for that for anyone in any other context. Just because someone has a spiritual title and professes to speak on the behalf of God, or whatever that looks like, does not give the right for you to be in an abusive relationship. Get out, move on, find a new place, talk to someone about it, and get help. And so, again, whether that's most certainly physical, emotional, verbal, all these things that happen, and most of the time, not most of the time, but many of the times when it comes to church abuse, it's an emotional, verbal, it's oppressive, and authoritarian, and all of those things we can address in a second. But here's another aspect of church leadership that many people don't understand. So full stop on that. Let's talk about the kinds of hurt that we experience, that maybe we experienced hurt because that person's broken. And you just don't know that. We expect our church leaders to be perfect. And there is a high standard for anyone entering into church leadership. But I also want to be empathetic and mindful of the toll that takes on someone. So being someone who has literally done it for 2 decades, I can speak from firsthand experience, and also the many experiences I've heard from other ministers I've talked to throughout the years. So a little bit of insider knowledge for you in this portion. Being a church leader, pastor, minister, whatever you want to call the title, is extremely taxing on a person. Here are the stats, okay? Just to throw this out there. So in 2023, surveys were done. So there are different groups that do studies on religious institutions. Barna group is one of them. Sometimes you'll get an AP poll that will go out that will collect data about church leadership. Barna group is the biggest one that collects data and does surveys about leadership, church attendance, things like that help us build statistics around what maybe is happening in our nation and across the world for that matter. And so in a survey that was done just a few years ago, 2023, Barna Group found out that 42% of those pastors surveyed considered quitting that year. 42%. Now think about that for a second. Of all the pastors that were surveyed, almost half of those pastors wanted to quit that year. Seriously considered is the question. Seriously considered quitting. 42%. That's a lot. That's a lot for any job. Imagine any job. I mean, and we're talking about careers. We're not talking about, part-time jobs that you get and you're like, well, of course, Joe, I want to quit all the time. No, you're talking about people who have entered careers And imagine that you're in your career and, like in the year, you're going, I got to quit. Now, all have hard days for sure. But to get to the point where you're seriously considering, I got to choose a new career, that's a big thing. So that that's something. So here's another thing that came out. So in the channel of Protestant churches, so if you narrow the focus a little bit, so not just Catholic and Protestant, Eastern Orthodox. So if you just channel into the Protestant movement, um, this statistic was scary. 18% of pastors considered self-harm, whether suicide or just physical self-harm. 18% of pastors that were surveyed at some point that year considered self-harm. That blows my mind. The people that should be leading through the joy and the goodness of God are just as broken as we are, oftentimes struggling just like we are. And the other studies that jump out that are just sad. When it comes to loneliness, feeling alone, loneliness, listen to this, 65% of pastors surveyed feel lonely. This means that the likelihood that you're at a church, if you still go to church, where the leader there feels alone. And you're like, but Joe, they're the most popular person in the room. They walk in the room and everybody loves them. I just, from firsthand knowledge, when's the last time you asked your church leader, how are you doing? When's the last time that you spent time with them in a significant way where they opened up and were transparent and vulnerable? See, a lot of times pastors, and I myself included when I was leading, and I had to work through a lot of this through counseling to get to a point where I could feel comfortable doing this. But a lot of pastors don't feel comfortable sharing what they're going through because they believe they have this internal sense of, I have to be perfect. So if someone in my church knows that I'm struggling with this addiction, or I'm struggling with this thing in my heart and in my mind, if they knew that, they would leave because they wouldn't see me as someone worth following. Because again, we, in our modern kind of Western world, we put pastors on this pedestal of perfection. And is it any wonder that so many of them fall? There's a lot of pressure and they feel alone. 65% of those surveys said they feel alone. Here's the last thing I'll say about this. So pastors are considering quitting, in some instances considering self-harm. They feel incredibly alone. And yet, listen to this statistic. This blew my mind. This was in 2023. Less than 1% of pastors in 2023 left their position, quit. So listen to this. 65% feel alone. 43% feel like they want to quit at a given time in a year. Some, it's so bad that they're considering self-harm, and yet only less than 1% actually quit, left the job. So this is what these statistics tell me. Most ministers, most pastors are depressed and broken inside, and yet they still stay at their job. That's shocking. So you have not the majority. The majority of those pastors that are working feel lonely. Almost half of them are considering quitting, but they don't. They stay where they're at. Why? Why, if that's how you're made to feel, why would you stick with it? Well, there's a couple reasons, and I'm going to go ahead and close those stats. There's a couple reasons. One, imagine for a second you're in your career and you come out of college and you go into that career and you study and you learn, and that's what you know, and that's what you've been doing, and that's what you wanted to do. And then you're faced with quitting. How do you begin to start a new career? How do you begin to go like, okay, so that's the practicalness of it. Like, I experienced this when I stepped down from ministry and being a pastor. I had to fill out a resume. What do I put on a resume that anyone's going to want? How do I even write that down? I help run services. I can talk about the Bible. I'm good with volunteers, whatever. The things are like, how do you put that in a resume that transfers to someone looking at your resume going, I'll give that guy a shot? It's super difficult, super difficult. And I have a friend that's experiencing that right now. How do you fill out a resume when all you've done is work at churches? So pastors stick with it because they're career pastors. What else are they going to do? What other skills do they have? It's not like they've built a career of skills of electrician or whatever that they can then just enter back into the workforce. No, they are career pastors, and they will most likely end their career pastoring if they can help it, whether that's at the church they're at now or a different church. A lot of pastors will move churches. So that's the practical side of it. The other reason why I think pastors stick around when maybe they shouldn't is because for someone to enter into ministry, there's this thing, and this might be new to some of you who've never heard of this before, but let me just tell you my experience and many other experiences. I believed, and I still believe, that God asked me to do this, that God wanted me to do this. And in some cases, God built me to do this. Like I'm wired a certain way to do pastoral ministry. I believe that's why I entered into it. So when I first resigned from being a pastor, I was leading a church for 10 years. And I resigned from that because of the very stats that you're seeing there, among other things. I wanted to quit. I was burnt out. I was tired. I felt like I couldn't give my best to the people I was leading. I felt like I had to move on. And the hardest thing about moving on was that I felt like I was letting God down. And so pastors, they have this internal value of this is what God wanted me to do, this belief that this is what God wanted me to do. And if I step away from that, did I fail? Did I fail God? And it's this internal pressure. Not that I think that that's true, but it's still something that's wrestled with. So you have all of these pastors that are sticking around, that are miserable, that are hurting inside, and they don't leave because they don't know what they're going to do. They don't know that there's a way out, and they're afraid to let God down, that they failed, that their life doesn't mean anything anymore. These are very real things that these pastors are dealing with. And so as we talk about church hurt and leadership hurt, can we just for a moment pause and be maybe a little empathetic towards the pressures that these pastors are facing? It is extremely difficult. That your job is to work with people when they're broken and hurting, and oftentimes at their worst. That's your job, to lead people through places where they can grow out of where they're at and into something more and better that we believe is the kingdom of God and Jesus and all these things. So it's extremely difficult. All that to say, we are talking about, though, those that stick around and they're broken and they're hurt and how they cause brokenness and hurt in others. Too often we see these church leaders that are more like what we would argue Jesus was referring to, those authorities that lord over the Gentiles. They lead like a authoritarian, like the Roman Empire, that they're the ones on top, that they're the ones in charge. You listen, you obey, don't question, don't doubt, don't bring anything up. You fall in line and be a good soldier. This is how, unfortunately, at least in the evangelical camps that I've been a part of, and this isn't everyone, right? I know that. Like, listen, I have so many friends that are still pastoring to this day that are trying to be what Jesus said to be, where we lead from below and lead up. But again and again, the reason why we see so many pastors fail is because we put them on top and they were never meant to be up there. You see all of these huge organizations that like leading in churches today is more like running a business than it is being a pastor. Like what was set up in the early centuries of the church has been morphed into running a business. Think about this for a second. For someone to be a pastor in the traditional sense that we're seeing it in the like evangelical, and again, that's my camp. I've never been Anglican. I've never participated in these more high church kind of systems. So there's probably checks and balances in there. I hope there is, and maybe someone who is a part of a more high church experience might be able to shed light on that. All that to say, what I'm thinking about are these like flashy, these pastors that are loud. They have big shows. They have big churches. Hundreds of thousands of people attending. These sorts of systems, and then even when you break it down to even smaller. I just worked at a church where the average attendance was in the 300s, and it had been growing. And so over the 4 years I was there, but there are systems in place. So think about this. Pastors in the early centuries of the church were in local communities where they weren't paid full time like we are today, and whatever money they did get was to help offset the time that they gave. So there were systems being put together to take care of those who were entrusted to take care of the community, but they didn't have big buildings. They didn't have full-time staff. They didn't have children's ministries. They didn't have youth programs. And so you have a pastor today that goes to school to be a pastor. They don't simply need to learn about how to rightly discern what is in our Bibles and help other people understand that too. No, they now must be CEOs. They got to hire staff. They got to do performance reviews with that staff. They got to create budgets around the building. And so how they're going to budget for different programs that the church does. They have to run events. They have to be counselors. They have to they have to wear all of these hats. And what happens is that when you get these pastors who take on all of that authority, they begin to control. They want to control and protect this empire. And this is what I think more churches are like today, that I have seen, is churches become these empires that if you threaten that empire, well, you get hurt. Just like in the Roman Empire, you threaten that empire, you're going to die. And so church hurt often comes through the lens of you posing a threat to their empire. They're not leading like Jesus, where Jesus says to be a slave. Like literally the leadership of the church, those who want to follow and lead in God's kingdom. That's the context of Matthew 20. They're talking about leadership. And Jesus says, whoever wants to be in a position of leadership needs to be the least among you. And so here's my challenge. If you're at a church and that leader is not the least among you, are they truly leading the way Jesus wants them to? If they're not being a servant and laying down their life in, to a degree that's healthy, right? Because listen, next week we're going to talk about people in the church. So we've talked about church last week. This week we're talking about leaders in the church. Next week we're going to talk about people in the church. People can be terrible to leaders in the church, right? So we can't skirt around that. This ain't all on that leader, right? But there is a sense where if you're in a place where the posture of the leadership of that church is they're the all-star, you're probably not in a Jesus church. If your leader in that church is the all-star in the room, who, they're the most important person, and if that leader were to leave today, the church would close its doors, you're probably not leading a Jesus-centered church. You're not probably a part of a Jesus-centered church. Jesus said, the way in which those who want to be in authority in church leadership, the way that we lead, is that we become a servant to all. Again, I'm not saying that's free reign for that person to get beat up and walked all over. But what it does mean is that church leaders today need to walk with humility in light of their calling as a church leader is not to be the big, awesome, the highest person on the, whatever org structure that you have. It's actually to put yourself at the bottom. And what would it look like for churches today to actually elevate the people that they're around? Let's just talk for a second about church staff teams. What would it look like for a lead pastor to not be the highest paid person in the room, to not be the final decision maker in any big decision, that they actually elevate and lead by serving those who are around them? here's a statement that I've said in business when I've talked to those in business, is that for your organization to be great, your people need to be great. Why do I say this? Because I believe in the ethic of leadership is about servant leadership. Like, this is what Jesus modeled, and this is what he calls us into. And if your lead pastor, if your minister and church leader is not leading through that posture, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get hurt. And so I want to encourage you with this as I wrap up. I'm just saying, if you're in a place right now where you're seeing abuse happen, verbally, controlling, authoritarian, it's okay for you to leave. It is. It's okay for you to leave. I know it's not going to feel that way. I know that you're going to be made to feel like you're, you know, the stupid Christian terms we use are like backslidden or sinning, or you're not being obedient. You're not, it's nonsense. Okay. These are tools that people use to keep people in line. And so you can let go of that and walk away. There are places that are beautiful in the church. There are leaders in churches that are serving their hearts out and doing their best for people. And it is a beautiful thing. So maybe it's time to leave, and that's okay. So all that to say, we have a problem. We have a crisis in church leadership. And the reason why we have that crisis is we have turned pastors and church leaders into all-stars, into businessmen, into CEOs, rather than the ethic of servant and leading up, they lead down. And I want to challenge, and I think that when I talk about the church is at a point of reckoning, the trajectory of like evangelical church is in the midst of reform, and it needs to be reformed, because all we have done has created empires that look nothing like the ethic and the kingdom of Jesus. And it's time that we start speaking that out. And in places that we speak it out, if it is not received, it's okay to move on. And so I want to just pull all this together and say this. Next week, we're going to talk about people in the church and what that looks like, and how we perceive going to church, and maybe some healthier ways that we can think about this, so that if you're considering going to church again in the future, maybe this is something you can have in the back of your mind. But all that to say, there's a lot more that could be said about this, but we'll leave it at that for now. All right, now we're going to do another comment on your comments. And for this one, we're going to come back to someone we did in the last video. This comment on your comments, I'm going to go ahead and bring it up now, is by Joshua Rowe. He made a comment that on one of my videos that was a comment and also a little bit of a feedback for the show. And I thought I'd respond to this because I thought it was, thoughtful. And no, it does not come across harsh. So thank you for that feedback. But this is what Joshua Rowe 3021 said. I went back and watched your older pod about the resurrection and found a lot of the same problems unsolved as the main commenter that you responded to. Okay, I want to respond to that in a second. Then you give me some feedback for the show. Here's an idea. Since your channel's supposed to be catering to the skeptics and the folks who do not believe the same things they were taught in Sunday school, why not have two people on the show? If you find someone who can ask skeptical questions while we are asking while listening, there could be discourse rather than a sermon. Sorry that these are coming off like a sermon. I would be much more interested in continuing viewing if that were the case. Plus, if you're drinking whiskey with someone else, I'd be more inclined to watch the whole taste thing. As it is, I skip every time. That's fair. Breaking the whiskey into a whole different section is strange and could simply be introduced while the topic is being introduced. Hope this doesn't come off as negative, for that is not my intent, just offering my 2 cents. Okay, well, first off, thank you and for your feedback, Joshua. I hope one day to sit down with you I mentioned to Caleb, your brother, who I know, that when you're in town, let's get together, have a beer, and talk more. There's a couple things I want to respond to here briefly. So your first comment was on a response about a video I made about the resurrection. And this came out at Easter, and I made a video where I introduced talking points about the historical reliability of a physical resurrection. And in it, I make certain assertions that I have held for much of my theological training on that subject. However, I think next year when I do that video in Easter, I'm going to change some things because I've been doing some reading. And I'm not sure I can hold fully to certain claims that I made. And before you think I'm rejecting the resurrection, that is certainly not the case. All I'm saying is that in one of my assertions is that all of the disciples died for this belief. And then there's this kind of turn of phrases say that people die all the time for things they believe. People don't all die all the time for things they believe, and they know that it's a lie, right? So it's this idea that what is the likelihood that these disciples were willing to die for something they knew they just made up? So what would be the motivation for that? So is it a proof text for the resurrection happened? No, but it is something that is used to communicate the likelihood of something like a resurrection taking place. All that to say, I listened to a scholar that I'm going to be reading his book here soon, where he actually does a bit more historical work on this idea of how did the disciples die, and it may be more muddy and muddled than once thought. So, that being said, stay tuned for that. And I'm not sure what areas of my rebuttal to what the commenters said thought was convincing or not, but maybe that's something we can discuss when we're in person. All that to say, thanks for the feedback. Now, about the show, I really appreciate this. You're the first person to actually give me feedback about the show in a constructive way, and I really appreciate that. There's a couple technical things. So let me just share a little bit, and this might be helpful for some of you that are watching, curious about why I do this the way I do this. But when we started Whiskey in the Writings, it was an avenue for me to share things that are just in my head, things I think about, things I talk with people about all the time. And people are like, oh, you should share that. But not so much in a sermon preachy way, which now I'm kind of bummed because you said it sounds like a sermon, but that's just your opinion. But it's just more of a talking point way. Now, the goal of this year, and this channel's only been around since January of 2025. So the goal of this year was a couple things. One, consistency. Can I continue to make videos in a consistent fashion, week over week over week for a calendar year? And for me to hit that goal, it needed to be me a talking head right now. So that was goal number one, is just, can I release content on the regular? Then two, I don't have the money and the gear to do a multi-person setup in the capacity that I want to do it, in the quality that I want to do it. So it was important for me that there's a high quality to these videos as well, in the sense of what you see here, and the sharpness, the crispness of the color. Required a certain camera and a certain lens and certain kinds of lighting that is all set up. This is in my office. So during the day when I'm working, I have a regular light on. I have a window to my left that's open. But when I do these videos, I have blackout curtains, I have key lights, and I have lighting behind me, and microphone that's right here, recording my voice that's going right in. So I just don't have the setup to capture two people. But one day, I hope that that's the case. I hope that I can bring people into the conversation where we're having dialogue about these topics. So that's actually the intent and the goals. That one day it will be multicam with capturing conversation with people. I hope for that, and maybe bringing on guests like yourself that clearly are thinking critical about certain topics that theologically inclined, and yeah, we can talk about that later. But that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing now. The whiskey, yeah, it's I'm not perfect at it, but I still like featuring the whiskey on its own. So that'll kind of be always a thing, but it would be fun to have someone tasting it with me. All that to say, thank you for the feedback. And for anyone else that has suggestions, comments, please feel free to leave them in there. And I can hopefully get to your comment or another comment in the future. So that's comment on your comments. And thank you for watching. Yeah, cheers. All right, everyone, thank you so much for watching. I know that we just got into, a little bit of this conversation and maybe not as much as you would want me to, but please leave a comment, leave me a note, let me know what you're thinking, and I can explore further in a different video or in a future video, maybe some things that I left unaddressed here today. All that being said, I really appreciate you taking the time and watching. Please like and subscribe and do all the things if that's what you want to do. Yeah, thank you for watching. Thank you for being a part of the channel, and I hope the best for you. Cheers.